think there is some clear successes, albeit limited by the Ukrainians, but they are clearly holding some of their best kit back in reserve. That they haven't really gone all in yet. And I'm looking at this because I'm aware that Chip, obviously has infinitely more military nous than myself. I'm looking at it from a political perspective as well, because there's a hell of a lot riding on this. In many, many capital cities, notably Washington, there are quiet conversations going on about how long can we keep supporting this, given prices of energy and food. And so that begs the question, what constitutes success? How much area has to be retaken? Do they have to go all the way to the Sea of Azov and cut the land bridge from Russia to Crimea in two, which builds confidence, mutes the discussion? Or if the front lines at the end of this in a few weeks' time are essentially unchanged, with much loss of life and, of course, the kit, the billions of dollars worth of kit that have been provided, then doubts begin to rise, including in Washington. And as that debate gathers strength in the autumn, there is the potential that support could begin to drain away. So there is a real political aspect to this military push.
Right, enormous riding on the success of this offensive. I mean, Chip, is it possible to give us some kind of an update on how well or not well the Ukrainian offensive is going from the information that's been coming across?
Well, the first thing I always say, John, quoting Field Marshal Wavell, is that 2/3 of initial reports in war are wrong, misleading, or inaccurate, and you've got a fairly OPSEC, operational security, sort of caveat from the Ukrainians and not so much from the Russians. And if the Russians were doing extremely successful, you'd have more exploitation in that media. So the first thing is hold your nerve and don't chase the error. And I don't think there is an error to chase at the moment. It looks like we can see three axes developing. The first one through Oryakov to Tokmak. And that to me is the key area, because if you then drew a line with Tokmak at the top of a triangle, and in the bottom of the triangle on the left, you had Melitopol, and at the right, you had Mariupol with Berdiansky in between. That is really the triangle of decision that you need to cut the ground locks, that's the ground lines of communication of the Russians. And if you get to somewhere between those points, you also then threaten in Berdiansky the sea lines of communication coming through those ports there. So it's crucial that they do that. I don't think anything's really gone terribly badly at the moment. But like all these things, it goes back again to JFC Fuller's theories of war. There's always a trade-off between the offense and the defense. There's always developments on each side. And in terms of what could be the changing character of war, we don't really know how things like electronic warfare will play into the use of drones on the Ukrainian side. We don't know how precision-guided munitions will play in, how their observed fire, their artillery is playing in. So there's still a lot of variables. Of course, I would have liked the Ukrainians to go in with some form of air parity or air superiority. That's essentially what the Americans did when they turned Desert Storm into the part where they went and unhinged the Iraqis. Without that, we just don't know how that's going to play out. But they'll war game this to death to make sure that they know what those variables are.
Yeah, and as I say, it's very hard to read it, I guess. I mean, given the difficulty of getting reliable information from the front line. But Chip, we do know, don't we? The Russians have had time to dig in pretty deeply, months to prepare for this offensive, and the destruction of or partial destruction of the Novokakova Dam. They'd also hoped that would slow down Ukraine's advance. Is there any evidence that has worked from the Russian point of view?
Again, I think it's too early to tell. So one thing, again, you can say from what we used to call tall building shots, but really are satellites overhead imagery, that we know in detail the layout of the Russian defensive position. It starts from the Flot, that's the forward line of the own troops, back through 5 to 25 kilometers with anti-tank ditches, Devil's Teeth, maybe 3 lines of trenches and anti-tank mines in there. Now that looks formidable, and it is. But in history, again, we've had the Maginot Line, the Siegfried Line, the Hindenburg Line, and essentially, again, in 1991, if you can create a breach and then get to what we call the expanding torrent, go deep, cut off those lines of communications, everything is possible, but we don't know how good the Russians will be at that, because having defensive systems, they're just an engineering problem if they're not covered by fire and observation. So I hope that the huge linear fortifications are not covered by fire and observation, and that those weaknesses are seen by the Ukrainians. They can breach in good order and then exploit quickly. That is the ideal situation to get to a kind of win big situation.
Yes. And Tim, what is your assessment of the strength of support, which, as you say, is so crucial here? And it may be tested over coming days, weeks, and months. But we can assume, can't we, that Washington, Germany, France, the capitals of those countries and around Europe, they will not have expected this to end like a war movie in a matter of days, of very few weeks, with titles rolling at the end. It was always going to be a slog.
Yes, there is this sense of reality, of course, in the capitals. You know, they're not expecting this a thunder run, as the Americans called that dash to Baghdad when they were advancing at 20 miles a day with a mechanized advance. Nobody is expecting that. So there is this sense of realism in the capitals. But Chip was referencing some great historical battles then. I have another historical touchstone. General William Westmoreland, Vietnam War. For 4 or 5 years in a row, he kept telling American presidents, right, just another 50,000 troops, just another 10,000 troops or whatever. And eventually he was fired after the Tet Offensive, which showed that the Americans were not winning. And the reason I bring that up is that despite that sense of reality, which we've just discussed, I do think if we get to the autumn without some sort of tangible success, a city retaken or reaching the Sea of Azov, something to get hold of, I do think that the discussions will break out more into the open. In Washington, it's Congress that funds this, and a majority of Republicans in Congress think that the Americans are sending too much help. And so that would grow louder. I mean, looking all the way ahead to next year, a Trump administration would probably pull the rug from underneath the Ukrainians to an extent, in which case some European capitals will follow, which is why I say there is so much politically riding on this, as well as the military aspect of it.